You're watching a lesson on working with group policy exceptions. Now, I want to start off by emphasizing that there are two previous lessons that it's important that you watch them before this one, especially the one on implementing a group policy infrastructure, where we saw the actual process flow of LSDOU. And the reason it's important that you watch that lesson before this lesson is because in this lesson, we're going to see how to break all the rules that we just learned about in that previous lesson. Now, before we do, I need to emphasize one thing, and I need to emphasize it in a pretty big way. Everything I'm going to talk to you about in this lesson, you should be using as the exception. And I guess no real pun intended, I don't know if that's the right thing to say there because this is called working with exceptions, but they really should be the exceptions, not the norm. Okay? You want group policy objects to flow in their normal native way, because every time you throw an exception in, it's like throwing a monkey wrench into the system, and troubleshooting becomes that much more difficult. But that said, let's go ahead and look at some of these exceptions. Okay, so here we are once again back on NYDC1, right, a domain controller, so that we can easily get in and look at things related to group policy. So I'm going to go ahead and hit the Start button on my keyboard to take me into the Start screen and click on Group Policy Management. In Group Policy Management, let's go ahead and expand some of this stuff out so that I can show you what some of these exceptions are. Okay, so the first exception, okay, and I really need to emphasize, by the way, you need to make sure that you watch the lesson on group policy processing before watching this lesson, or this isn't going to make any sense. Okay, because it was in that lesson that we learned about the order of processing, application, and inheritance of group policy objects. Okay, so as long as you understand the default processing order and how things work, then we're going to look at some of these exceptions. And the first one here is called block inheritance. Now, we saw block inheritance when we looked at NTFS permissions. And this is not really that much different, okay? Since we know that we have this hierarchy of LSDOU, if we go down to a lower container, so let's go down to an organizational unit. We'll take New York, for instance. If I right-click on the New York container, I can select block inheritance. And you'll see that I get a blue circle with an exclamation mark in it. I know it's kind of hard to see. It's real small there. But what that symbol represents is that it basically says this container is not going to accept any settings from above. Okay, so the settings that were set above that are supposed to be inherited down, we're going to ignore that. And we are only going to accept group policy object settings that have been linked directly to this container, which, as you can see, are none right now. But if I want any GPO settings to apply to users and or computers in this container, I would have to link those group policy objects directly to this container. Now, there's another exception, which is the exact opposite of block inheritance. And that is something that you would do at more of a parent level. And I will tell you that it's not done at the actual level itself. So it's not like I would do it up here at the domain, but on a link to a higher level. So if I have this default domain policy linked up here to the domain, if I right-click on this group policy object, there is a setting here called enforced. Now, if this is not the first time you're learning about this, if you go back to the days of Windows 2000, there was something called no override. Well, this is the exact same setting. They just changed the name. No override became enforced. If I click on enforced, and you'll see there's like this lock that appeared on it. What that is a setting that makes it that everything below me, right? So all the organizational units and everybody below me are going to have to take my settings, whether they like it or not. I'm enforcing these settings. The way I like to think of the padlock is, if you remember in the processing lesson where I talked about it's like flipping a light switch on and off as different people are walking into a room. Well, this is like one person walking in and doing whatever they're going to do to the light switch, and then putting a lock over it, saying, I've done something and I'm enforcing that no matter what. So there's two things that I want to tell you about this enforced rule here. The first thing is, kind of like I just said, if there is a conflict between the setting in this policy and any settings below me, my setting wins. I put that lock over the light switch. Nobody else can flip it. The second thing that it does is it takes block inheritance and says, too bad. You may be blocking all other group policy objects, but you're not blocking me. And one of the ways that I used to analogize this back in the days when I used to do this in the classroom, and hopefully this will work just as good through this recording, is, I have 4 kids. And so as a parent of 4 children, everything in my brain seems to somehow relate to how parents and children interact. And that's kind of how I look at it here, is you have a child, okay, and we'll say that that child is the organizational units and the parent is the domain. So you have these children, right? And as a child, by default, you inherit the things that you do, right? Decisions that you make and actions that you take and decisions in your life. You inherit a lot of these ideas from your parents. But you also can have ideas of your own. As a human, even as a child, you have ideas of your own, and ultimately your actions do end up being your own. And sometimes as a child grows older, and if you have children, especially if you have, well, we'll say teenage children, you'll probably be able to relate with this, because I do have teenage children. Eventually, your children get to an age where they almost start to get to the point of thinking, you know what, I don't need to really listen to any of your rules anymore. I make my own rules, and I make my own decisions on my own actions. And that's what this block inheritance is like. Is your child getting old, thinking that they are ready to be an adult, saying, no, you know what, I'm 18 years old now. I'm going to make my own decisions. I'm an adult. I don't need to inherit anything down from you. And that may even be true as we grow older, right? Even as we become adults and we look at our parents, we might say, no, you know what? I don't need to take decisions from you. I make my own decisions. That's block inheritance. You know what enforced is? That's the parent looking down at the child and saying, you know what? You still live in my house. You live in my house, you are going to obey my rules, okay? Or at least certain rules that maybe I'm going to enforce. I don't know if that helped you or not, but that was an analogy that I used to use over the years in the classroom, and I had a lot of feedback come back to me and say that helped them to understand what this block inheritance and enforced really meant. Okay, so those are the two primary exceptions that we want to understand when it comes to, changing processing. But we have some other exceptions, and we have, I'm already highlighted on a policy right here. Okay, I clicked that, there we go. We're already highlighted on a policy here, and if you'll notice over here on the right where it says scope, all right, make sure you're on the scope tab. Down here we have security filtering. Security filtering is a way of further filtering who this group policy object is going to affect. You'll see that by default, it's affecting all authenticated users, but we don't need it to. We could remove authenticated users, and we could add in, let's put in sales users. Guess what? What we've just done is we've made it that this group policy object is only going to affect sales users. Now you need to be careful here, because some people think to themselves, well, why do we even need to use this whole link into the organizational units and the domains and the sites? And why do we even need that? Why don't we just use users and groups just like we do everything else, like with NTFS permissions and shared permissions and printer permissions and everything else? Well, you need to understand that when it comes to GPOs, the link comes first. In other words, if we have a GPO that has been linked to a container, it's only going to affect the users and or computers in that container. This is going to then further filter from there. Okay, so you're starting with the pool of the users that are in the container, and then from that pool of users, you can further filter it down to say from those guys, only the ones that are also a member of the sales users group. Now, this is one way of using security filtering in the sense that we're saying only apply this group policy to a certain group. But what if we want to go the other way around? What if we want the group policy object to apply to all users? Okay, so we're going to put this back. I'm going to remove the sales users, and I'm going to put back authenticated users. All right, so now this group policy object is affecting everybody, but I want to exclude a certain user or group. Well, then what I can do is I can go, and this is a little bit trickier, I can go to the Delegation tab. On this Delegation tab, in the lower right-hand corner here, we have an Advanced button. I'm going to click on Advanced, and look what happens. I get a window with permission settings, just like we've seen in other areas of Windows Server. I'm going to go ahead and add a group, and actually I think the group was already there, so let me cancel. Yeah, as that window came up, I noticed Domain Admins is already here. If I take the Domain Administrators, and let's say that I don't want this policy to affect the Domain Administrators group. I want it to affect everybody else, but not Domain Admins. Then what I need to do is if I scroll down here, there is a permission called Apply Group Policy. I'm going to deny the application of this group policy to this particular group, to the Domain Admins group. Or to do what I was going to do before, let's say there was a specific group, I could click Add, and let's do Sales. Now, the reason I wanted to do Domain Admins is that's a more typical one to do an exclusion on, right? You want to exclude administrators. Let's say we're going to exclude the sales users. I take that group. You'll notice they have no other permissions. Deny the applying of group policy. And now, oh, look at this. I get a little warning. Anytime you select deny as part of, and this is true even if you go all the way back to your NTFS permissions or share permissions, anything else. You may remember from those lessons that the rules were always least restrictive, but deny always overrides everything else. That's what this warning is telling you. Hey, deny is going to override everything else, and you may have some, effects that you weren't expecting. So are you sure you want to do this? And I'm going to say, yeah, I know what I'm doing. I click yes. And now the sales users will not be affected by this group policy object. This stuff can be dangerous though. Okay, so be careful. Matter of fact, just in case, and I know I'm not going to affect anything that matters here, but just in case, I'm going to actually remove that setting that I just did for the sales users, because I don't want to deny that. Matter of fact, I'm also going to, let me jump back in here. I didn't do that to the Domain Admins, did I? No, okay, I didn't do that. I want to make sure, I didn't want to get myself, locked out of anything, and that's why you want to be careful with all these settings. All right, so what do we have so far? We've blocked inheritance. We've done an enforced setting. We've done security filtering. If we come down here to the bottom, we have something called WMI filtering. This is where we can get very specific to the hardware on a system that's being used. So if there are certain settings, and we only want those settings to take place if we have enough, let's say, enough memory installed on the computer to handle it, or enough processing power, or enough hard drive space, right? If we were doing software installation, let's say it's going to tie up a lot of hard drive space. We want to make sure we have enough hard drive space. That's where we can do WMI filtering. Now, I'm not going to go in and show you an actual WMI filter. Okay, there's a whole scripting language that you have to put in. Okay, so if this is something you want to do, by all means, look up WMI filters, look at the query language that you need to use. It starts with your whole select star. If you've worked with SQL at all, okay, you know a little bit about the querying language. But basically, I wanted you to understand that's another type of filtering, another type of exception that we have here. And to be more specific, I should show you. In this window, right, I'm actually on a policy itself. This is where I can say, there's a specific WMI filter. You'll notice there's none to choose from. If I go to the WMI filters container, this is where I have the ability to go ahead and create a new WMI filter. And again, you have to have this special query to make the filter in the first place. Now, there's one last type of exception that I want to show you, and it's actually done through a setting itself within the group policy object. I know this sounds a little bit weird, but yeah, it's a setting that's actually in the object. If I were to go into one of my group policy objects, we'll just take the default domain policy. Again, not typically where we would go. We would create one specifically for this. But if I go in to edit that policy, under computer configuration, under policies, under administrative templates, under system, ooh, look at that. You get a whole lot of them now. Let me move this window over, make it a little bit easier to see. Look at this. Got a whole list under system. If I click on group policy, whoo, look, there's another really long list here. Well, on this long list, and you got to kind of look through here, and I'm actually going to show you something in just a moment to make it a little bit easier to follow. Right down here, we have configure user groupback policy loopback processing mode. And I'm going to double click on it. And if you read through the explanation here, it's going to tell you what it's doing, but here's the idea. And see if you can follow along with this, because this is one that has been confusing since the day this was first created. This has been around since Windows 2000, and it's been confusing since Windows 2000. But once you get it, it actually is something that really makes a lot of sense. What this has to do with is deciding which group policies are going to be implemented. I mentioned in the group policy processing lesson that computers will process the computer configuration settings when they are booted. Right? When you first boot the computer, that's when those settings are applied. And I mentioned that the user settings are applied when the user logs in. But here's what I didn't tell you, and that is that when the computer boots up, it will do the group policy objects for the containers that the computer object exists in. So I'll tell you what, let me cancel and close out of here for a minute. We'll come back to this. But let's take a look here. You see how I have NY computers and I have NY users? When a computer first boots up, it's going to do the group policy objects and do the whole LSDOU thing based upon where the computer object exists, which we would say would be in the example here, in the NY computers container. And so it's going to look at any group policy objects that are linked to that container. And so I'll tell you what, just for the sake of understanding this, let me real quick create a GPO and link it here. And I'm going to call this NY computers GPO. And I'm going to create another GPO in NY users here. And I'm going to call it NY users GPO. And I'll expand these just so you can see that they exist. When the computer first turns on and it exists in this container, it will apply all the group policy objects through the hierarchy, including this one right here that says New York Computers GPO. When a user sits down at that specific computer and logs in, believe it or not, this GPO is no longer looked at. This GPO will now be looked at because the user object was in the NY users container. Okay, that's the default way of processing. What loopback is going to do, and you would do it on the computer's GPO, so let's go in here and edit this GPO. Under policies, administrative templates. By the way, remember how I had to remember to come down here to system and then group policy and then dig through here, and so many of them. I always have to look for just a moment here to find this computer using group policy loopback processing mode. I could also come here to all settings, and I could right click and go to filter options, and I could go ahead and say I'm looking for loopback and click OK, and look at that, I find it. And it also tells me where I can find it under system group policy. Okay, so if that helps with the locating of a group policy object or searching for one, that's just a little tip I wanted to show you there. But anyway, let's go into this setting. And if I enable this, what we are doing, and I'm going to actually close out of here just to show you what we're doing, is we are telling this computer, because this is a computer setting, right? Any user that sits down and logs into this computer, this user is going to be in what's called loopback processing mode, which means we are not going to go to the container where the user exists to do those settings. What we are going to do is we are going to stick with this particular container and this particular group policy object, And when the user logs on, it's these user settings that are going to be implemented. The ones from this GPO right here. These are the group policy settings that we're going to use. We're going to loop back to this policy, not use the policy where the user is linked. Now, if I come back here into the setting, I want to show you that there are two different modes. There's merge mode and replace mode. And it says right here, replace mode indicates that the user settings defined in the computer's group policy objects, these right here, replace the user settings that would normally be applied to the user. That's the one where we're truly saying, no, use these settings, not whatever settings are on the GPO linked to the container where the user is. Whereas in merge mode, we indicate that the user settings defined in the computer's group policy object and the user settings that would normally be applied are combined. So now what we're saying is, no, you know what? Go ahead and apply those group policy settings based upon where the user is at in the container the user's in. But then when you're done with that, come back here and apply these settings based upon the computer object, or I should say the container where the computer object is. And then if the settings are in conflict, I win. Okay, so merge mode means go ahead and do the user settings like normal and do my settings. And if there's a conflict, I win. Whereas replace mode means don't even look at the user settings. They don't even exist. Only look at the computer object settings. Okay, so it's looping back to using these settings here rather than coming down to the settings that would be in this GPO here. That is what loop back processing mode is. Now, where does this come in handy? The most common use that I've heard of, the most typical use, would be in a kiosk type environment where you have a computer that is not sitting on somebody's desk where the same user typically logs in, but more in the environment where you have a computer that the public has access to. And regardless of what user logs in, it may not have to be public. Like it doesn't have to be a kiosk like in the mall, like in a shopping mall. It could be a kiosk in the lobby of an office building and various employees will come through and use it for some specific purpose, but you want certain security settings to be in place regardless of who logs in. It doesn't matter because it's too public a computer to run the risk. That's where loopback is typically used. All right, so those are some of the exceptions that you need to keep in mind that are available when it comes to altering the default processing of group policy objects. All right, so that brings us to the end of this lesson and really the end of this 3-lesson set that I've put together on working with group policy. Okay, and in this lesson, well, we saw how to kind of break the rules and use some exceptions, or really I should say make some exceptions to the normal flow and processing of group policy objects. And I said this at the beginning of the lesson, and I'm going to say it again now. You should use these exceptions sparingly. Okay? These exceptions are like throwing a monkey wrench into things. And when you throw a monkey wrench into things, it makes it so hard to figure out what's going on. All right? So that's just something I really want you to take with you when working with group policy exceptions. All right, so I know that was a lot because we had 3 lessons on group policy, but that's all I have for you, at least for now. So yeah, go take a break, and I'll see you in the next lesson.